So this is an important question for us. Personally, crisis is not enough. We actually have to figure out like what happens next so that all the systems we throw into crisis don't just further consolidate. When you think about the crisis created, for example, by the protests against the war in Iraq, right, in 2003, that were some of the largest protests in US history. But we are still at that war, and in the war in Afghanistan, in big numbers, and the defense budget is way up, right? So we really have to ask, like, what does it take to produce like the actual dismantling that we're seeking? And I think the big question for a lot of us is this is a moment where there's immense opportunities for mobilization. Like, people are pissed and scared, right? Like, for really good reasons, like for climate reasons, for like surveillance reasons, for really good reasons. And is it going to be mobilization or is it going to be demobilization? And I don't think the answer to that is obvious by any means right now. Demobilization. I'm annoyed by the ACLU. This is what they put up right after the election. I hope you guys know that we are never going to sue our way out of any of this. You know, settler colonialism, white supremacy is the law in the United States. It has been from the first day, right? And so the idea that we should just give money to the ACLU and like wait for good things to happen is so deeply irresponsible and deeply demobilizing. They also put up this one. I'm sorry to pick on them, it just was on the surface of my mind today. They put up this one where they asked us all to take an oath that we're going to protect the Constitution. Like, what does that even mean? You know what I mean? Like, how are you going to do that? And like, the Constitution, again, a document that keeps slavery in place. I mean, anyway, so the idea, one of these questions is like, what are we being told is mobilization that's not mobilization? That's like a really heavy one for us to look at. And I think there's a lot of danger right now. You know, there are these massive corporations that are like both like, you know, getting tax breaks, gentrifying our cities, and their job is to get us to write free content for them for these websites they have, right? Facebook, Twitter, right? And we all work for them for free, saying a bunch of stuff, and then we're like exhausted and think we've done our job as activists. And that's just, it's just not gonna do it. I mean, I obviously think there's a lot of benefit to all of our connections online, and I met the first trans people I ever knew online, and I think there's a lot of amazing things, especially for deeply isolated communities, that can happen online, but there's also like, it's such a demobilization strategy to get us to only spend our energy declaring our views, which just doesn't do anything. Like, you can tell people your views all day long, it just doesn't, like, it does very little, and mostly like we're seeing it are people who are similar to you or in like very close proximity, but you feel like you've said something in public, but it's like not actually as public as it pretends to be. Anyway, so one of the parts of this discernment conversation is this question of whether or not a particular tactic or reform is recuperative, right? That's like a kind of debate that I want us to be having. Some of the criteria I've been using to think about that for the last 10 years or so are like, does it provide material relief? Right? Like, is anyone actually going to have any more housing, any less being locked up, any less being deported? Does it leave out an especially marginalized part of the affected group? Right? So like, this will work, but not if you have a criminal record. This will work, but not if you don't have documents. This will work, but only if you have enough money to pay for your own healthcare. You know, like that kind of stuff. That's a sign that we're being divided into deserving, undeserving, that we're being divided from our basic power and asked to leave behind the most vulnerable. Does it legitimize or expand a system we're trying to dismantle? That's like a vital question we always have to ask. And does it mobilize the most affected for ongoing struggle? So it's not just the outcome, but also the tactics. Are the tactics mobilization tactics? Or is it like behind closed doors, somebody's making a deal and, you know, I'll scratch your back and you scratch mine and we'll declare a victory, but it hasn't changed the power that people have been talking about us needing to build. So those are the ones I've been thinking of for a few years. But I've been interested also in gathering other people's criteria, so that's what I'm gonna share with you now. So Jason Leiden introduced me to this book by Peter Gelderloos many years ago that I recommend, called How Nonviolence Protects the State. It's a really useful book that critiques certain kinds of pacifism that are often used to marginalize armed resistance struggles for decolonization and anti-racism. But Peter Gelderloos also wrote a different book called The Failure of Nonviolence, and in it he asks this question about, is it liberatory? And he asks it at a bunch of different movement moments around the world and domestically over the last few years. It's interesting. I don't agree with all of his outcomes, but I love watching how people apply these criteria. One question he asks is, does it seize space in which new social relations can be enacted? Which is a really juicy question for me, listening to this weekend's conversations about housing cooperatives and anti-gentrification work and throwing glitter into the air and putting the nail polish on the rubber gloves. I love that story. did people, I actually think about Occupy to some degree when I think about this, because when I try to talk to my students about consensus decision making and non-hierarchical forms of organizing, the only time most people in the United States have ever even seen or heard of a meeting where there wasn't like a boss, a parent, a principal, a teacher kind of like at the top was Occupy. You could watch videos online, or you could go out to your local Occupy if there was one, and see people trying to make decisions in pretty hard conditions, because anyone could walk up, right, in a horizontal way and with a set of guidelines. And so that's new social relations. It's also new social relations when we give food away. It's also new social relations when we take care of each other's kids, right? New social relations being anytime we like don't do what capitalism tells us to do, which is like hoard and hide and be in private and act super racist to each other and all that stuff. So that's an interesting question that Gelderloos is asking that I think we can apply. Also, there was a discussion about how important cultural work is, and I think this is another way we can think about cultural work is often a space where new social relations are proposed and enacted. Does it spread awareness of its ideas? So he's not talking about like, have you heard of it? He's talking about like, did you start a chapter? Like, did you practice it, right? Which is, I think, a good question. Does it have elite support? This is where I really love his work. He's just like, if it has elite support, it's probably not really transformative. Boom, right? Because people are always like, can we get the elected official to come to our meeting? You know what I mean? I love this. I'm like, this is very challenging to us. Like, if it has elite support, it's probably not transformative. Whoa, liberatory. And he asks a similar question to mine about material relief. Does it achieve any concrete gains in people's lives? Mariam Kaba, if you're going to read one person's work, I would read her work. If there's one person who I believe has the answers, it is her. She has the answers. She's like the answer person. The rest of us have questions. And she just wrote this one piece that I use a lot and think about that's kind of an example of this kind of thinking, where she's asking, how do we evaluate police reforms in this moment of crisis of legitimacy for the police? There's lots of reform proposals, right? Does it allocate more money to the police? If it does, she's like, it's not going to work for us, right? That's a great question. Oh, but they're going to hire women of color cops who are going to be de-escalators. No. Oh, they're going to hire trans persons. No. They're going to build a special center where you can walk in and relax. No. I made that up. Does it advocate for more police or more policing? I just had this conversation with these activists in San Diego who, they're trans activists. I think they're planning like the first trans pride or some kind of trans event during the pride season, whatever. And they're having a debate in their group about whether or not to have cops there. And the debate is partly between like parents of trans kids who are like yes cops and like trans people who are like no cops, which is really interesting. And the big rationale is that the San Diego Police Department has a trans police officer, so therefore it must be great. That is like the kind of level at which we are operating. That is so painful, that kind of, are we that easy to buy off? You just hire one, anyway. Is the reform primarily technology focused, right? So thinking about like the inadequacy of something like body cams, this is very useful. And is it focused on individual dialogues with individual cops, right? Does it move us out of thinking about systems and towards thinking about like bias as an individual problem, which is the way bad apples, the whole way they want us to think about cops, so people want us to think about Zionism, so people want to, individualization at that level is very depoliticized and demobilizing. Harsha Walia wrote another book I really love called Undoing Border Imperialism. She is a longtime member of No One is Illegal in Vancouver. She's a really brilliant migrant justice activist. She asks this question: has the tactic been effective in exposing or confronting a specific point within the system by either diminishing its moral legitimacy or undermining its functions? Her whole book is like this genius strategy book about like, what do you do when you're No One is Illegal and you're a border abolitionist group, but you're also going to collaborate with all these other groups on a particular campaign around an individual who's in detention. She looks at like, what does it mean to do individual services and how does that relate to our broader political frame? Her book is amazing. But the example that I love of this question she's asking is this amazing action they did in 2008. There was a guy named Laibar Singh who was going to be deported, and No One is Legal organized with a lot of people, and they turned out 2,000 people at the Vancouver International Airport and shut down the international terminal. Like, that is amazing. This is long before the airport actions we recently saw in the US, which I think we should be continuing. I mean, what if we shut down the airport every time they tried to deport somebody? Like, it just raises the idea of what might be possible. We'll just see it, and there's a video, you can watch the video online, and like every time I watch it, I'm just like shivering. It's like so amazing. And then Audre Lorde, I loved Grace Hong's book, which made me reconsider this piece by Audre Lorde, this question: in what way do I contribute to the subjugation of any part of those I call my people? Like, what a good criteria what a good question for us to ask ourselves in those moments when we're being asked to compromise, when we're being asked to accept a lesser tactic, when we're being asked to collaborate with a system that we can see as murderous, right? Who and what kinds of ways we have to rethink my people over and over again to capture that, you know? I just love that as a criteria for our work. Okay, so the strategies that, you know, I think of us, and I get this from prison abolition, the strategies that I think are what our queer radical past, present, and future are full of is doing politicized survival work, doing the dismantling work, and building the world we want and need. Like, those are the 3 things we have to do, just that. We can do it after this talk. Right, those are the pieces. And I think it's useful to think about those pieces because I feel very, doing this work is hard. This is a hard time to be alive. This is like a deeply anti-revolutionary time in which it can feel like our politics are illegible. It can feel like people have been deprived of so much information about social movements that we're beating our heads up against that. It can feel like there's no resources. So I think it's helpful to be involved in all 3 of these kinds of work because most of the time I'm like unsatisfied or like feeling, oh God, is this even working? About lots of things that I'm doing. But also some people do deep dives into one part of this and spend their whole life like doing beautiful work in one of these columns. But what I really want to talk about today is mutual aid work because especially since the election, what I have felt most strongly, and this is kind of my proposal honestly, is that we need to revive deep, consistent mutual aid projects as a way to mobilize people and meet the severe needs that we're all facing, and especially some people are facing under the conditions that are as they are now and that are definitely worsening. They're definitely worsening. They're not getting better. It doesn't matter who the next president is. It's on fire. Mutual aid is about providing material support to people who are trying to survive the existing systems. It is about political participation that's based in care and action. So it's not just saying what you believe in, it's having a constant part of your life that is doing what you believe in. And I think that is both like vitally necessary for our survival and well-being, and it also feels a lot more satisfying, I think, and it gives people a chance to have a political life that is more sustained in meaningful relationships that saves all of our lives ultimately. It's about building actual safety and well-being, and it's about preparing for disasters. Obviously, the disasters have already been here the entire time. Colonialism is a disaster, white supremacy is a disaster. All those disasters are ramping up, and new forms of disasters are happening. It's time to think about disaster preparedness. Not that we haven't always been thinking about that. It's really important, I think, especially when I talk to young people, because a lot of folks I meet who are, especially like just entering college or entering school, are like, the only thing they've been exposed to that's about helping others is like going to a soup kitchen or something that's really on a charity model. So let's just take a moment to talk about the difference between mutual aid and charity. Charity is generally about celebrating rich people's generosity. Historically, charity comes from the idea of like rich people giving money so they get into heaven, or now it's often like rich people giving money so they can like make their hideous corporation look like cleaner because they think it's something good. Right? You see it. This is not right. So that's what charity is usually about. And charity often has a framework around saving poor people by blaming them individually for their poverty. So it's like, oh, you're homeless. That must be because you use drugs. If you can have a clean urine for 30 days, we'll put you on a wait list for 7 years to someday get a bed and shelter. Like, it's just like as if the person's poverty is the fault of their behaviors, right? As opposed to the fault of having a capitalist housing system, right? And a lot of charity frameworks are about that. Like, take this med and take these urine tests and do this parenting class, and then maybe we'll give you something, but probably not. Like that. It's all about controlling people, right? And the broader welfare system uses these frameworks. Charity is about identifying the deserving poor. So, who does and doesn't deserve to get a bed tonight, who does and doesn't deserve, a scholarship, all of these things, right? It's all about and that always implies that there is a killable, disposable poor, and that is actually most people. So you have to try to be the exceptional poor, which not surprisingly will be whiter people and all those, people who are more gender conforming are going to get chosen as deserving. And the charity model is what has produced all the nonprofit industrial complex problems that we talked about before and many more. Mutual aid has a different set of principles. One is that the system, not people suffering under it, is what creates poverty, crisis, and vulnerability. Another one is that if we're going to solve it, we need governance and control by people who are the most impacted. This does not mean there's not a role for allies in mutual aid. Actually, the thing that's amazing about mutual aid is that there's a way for every single person to plug in, but it's about looking to the leadership and demands of people who are the most vulnerable, because the people who have more, who are winning more in the system, are going to have more buy-in forms. Our visions are distorted by our buy-in. So we need to hear the kind of stronger understanding of the system that comes from people who are actually being killed by it. So it's essential that governance and control be with people who are most impacted. Mutual aid principles, at their best, it's about building projects, mutual aid projects and organizations that are transparent and democratic, that are not at all about a couple of paid professionals deciding who gets help today, right? And they're really about, membership models that bring in a lot of people, ideally. It's about having open meetings and pathways for new people to join. I mean, just as an aside, we have a broader problem, a related problem, that's happening now, which is that because of the habit of declaring ourselves and our politics online, and I think this is especially true for people who are my age and younger, because it makes us look cool to have tight politics online, we're really, really good at tearing things down. And we really love to be like, oh my God, I tore down the furthest left thing I could imagine. I must be the super coolest person. Not helpful to our movements, and it's very hard for people to enter movements when you have to already know all the language and you have to already say everything perfectly. So we need to find ways to be like, yeah, there is a way, we'd like to be treated like, oh yeah, that word doesn't look wonderful, please don't call me that, or whatever. More people actually have a chance to learn stuff, because when you enter any kind of politicized space, you have to unlearn a ton of stuff. And so how do we create politicized spaces that have actual entry points and that aren't just spaces where I can make myself a little cooler by being the one who knew the tighter critique? Because also I can say, as somebody who's 40, inevitably you're going to lose that place anyway. So it's just good to get used to it. We're all messing up all the time, and it's beautiful, and it's great to learn how to give and receive feedback. So having pathways for new people, both in terms of the culture of our orgs and spaces, but also in terms of in the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, the one of the organizations I work in that Emily's mentioning, for us it was really important to realize, we need to have certain kinds of regular open meetings, because people who are homeless and are not likely to be getting any emails or seeing phone messages need to be able to just come regularly. A lot of groups that do mutual aid do that, right? Having regular open meetings, having things like that are just pathways that low barriers to be part of an org. So that maybe there's places in the org where you're yes, I commit to 20 hours a month, but also there's ways to participate if you can't do that, right? So having many, many ways to participate. Using political education inside organizations to build solidarity. These are all strategies, of course, that have been with the queer radical left for a long time, right? So knowing that people enter orgs, right? SRLP as an example, you might enter SRLP because you are having trouble in the shelter system, but you might also be holding views that are anti-immigrant. That can happen, right? Yes, you're there and you're trans and you are part of the shelters and you're pissed about stuff, but you also, and so it's being in an org can be the place where we actually find out about solidarity with each other. Well, we have some things in common and we have significant intergroup difference. What does it take for me to become connected to you more and learn about the parts of me that got developed to get in the way of our connection, right? And build our strength by becoming more connected through shared political education, or make that's we all need to sit down and really learn about Puerto Rico. Actually, one of the first things we ever did in SRLP, political education-wise, when we watched my favorite documentary, Palante Siempre Palante. We were here we are. We named this organization after Sylvia Rivera. She was this amazing Puerto Rican activist. Let's sit down and learn about the Young Lords, and let's learn about the Puerto Rican struggle in New York City. And that there's Puerto Rican people in SRLP, and there's lots of non-Puerto Rican people in SRLP. That kind of work where we decide to build deeply with each other so that we can be in deep alliance, right? Humility and willingness to accept feedback. These are the interpersonal skills we desperately need to be inside these movements together. We need to work on conflict resolution skills and processes. I think there's a lot of wisdom in people, in the group of people who did those housing cooperatives and other flat organizations in the 60s and 70s and 80s that I think we're not using right now. We need to build some more bridges to lift up those tools if we want reinventing the wheel on all of those things. My idea about the need for mutual aid in this particular moment of this presidency is that I also think people are more likely right now to be oh, maybe I heard about one march and went once, but that doesn't necessarily build us the long-term political community that we need to survive and to participate and work deeply. So what does it mean to say okay, we're getting together, me and my friends, and we're gonna think about whether we could do a court support project, and we're gonna commit to do it for definitely 3 years. And then we're gonna be with each other through conflict in that, and we're gonna start small and make it 1 day a week or make it 1 day a month. And, just really to decide to commit is I think that long-term participation is really significant. Black and Pink is a really good example of this. this kind of work is about connection to and solidarity with transformative work. Because part of this is if I'm part, let's say I'm just part of a childcare collective, but it's operating with these principles, I'm going to know about the fight around repealing the rent regulation law in Massachusetts or in Seattle, the same problem. And I'm going to show up to that too, right? Like, how am I going to be networked in beyond the one issue or the one piece I'm working on? And that's what I think mutual aid has often done. And all of this is about commitment to dignity and self-determination for people in need and in crisis. And a lot of these groups use consensus-based or other kind of flat decision-making rather than majority rule, right? Part of this is about how can we cultivate a desire for each other's participation. I actually want to hear what other people in this group have to say, even if they disagree with me, instead of I just want to get my point through. Like, that is the kind of quality of, I would say, like a certain kind of maturity or personal development that we all need to build radical movements, is a desire to hear each other, even in disagreement, and a desire, I want you to come back to this meeting so bad that I'd rather hear what you have to say that I don't like right now than make it hostile for you here. Like, that is some deep work that I think we've all been in groups that have succeeded or failed at that. Some of my favorite examples right now of mutual aid projects, Oakland Power Projects, it's part of Critical Resistance. They are building alternatives to calling 911, right? So when you call 911, the cops always come too, not just the ambulance, and then people get hurt. And so they are building, they're doing deep trainings with people to learn acute healthcare skills like gunshot wound, chronic healthcare skills like, for instance, for people with diabetes, things like that, and like mental health support skills, so that theoretically you wouldn't have to ever call 911 and deal with the cops showing up. And we see that again and again, especially people in mental health crisis being killed when the cops show up. So I just love that project, and what a brilliant idea to make a neighborhood kind of 911 proof would be, that's a long-term goal, but they're really doing that. I love this project, this jail support project that came up in Baltimore after the Freddie Gray uprising. A lot of people spent a lot of time getting arrested, and there was a lot of people became aware of what the jail is like in Baltimore, and so they started a project where they hang out outside the jail a certain number of hours a week, and they're there. Anybody who walks out, they might give you, phone to make a call. Do you need a ride anywhere? Do you need, what are some? They can't give you everything, but they can give people some basic support. And I love this because it's not a deserving undeserving. It's not just for queer people or just for, it's just whoever comes out of the jail, which is just, that's like, how do we get past only looking for like the deserving special, people who we think we care about. I love that project. Obviously, all the prisoner letter writing projects all over the country are such an example. They're probably one of the strongest long-term mutual aid networks happening consistently in the U.S. All these mostly unfunded, volunteer-based groups that do a very essential work that is is really powerful, very long-term work. There's a lot of interesting stories about child care collectives. I think that makes a lot of sense, figuring out how to do child care collectives to support people to participate politically or just to get by. I'm really interested in prison transportation projects. Most of us live in states where the prisons are really far from places where people are primarily incarcerated from, and so people doing we're just going to give rides to families to visit prisoners. It makes a huge difference in people's health and their well-being and their likelihood of being able to get out and stay out if they can retain community bonds. All kinds of support support. I mean, my dream and fantasy about thinking about mutual aid in this way is what if nobody ever went to a public benefits hearing alone? What if nobody ever went to housing court alone? What if nobody ever went to criminal court alone? What if everybody was accompanied? Even if you're gonna lose, even if your case isn't political in the sense that we all know you're arrested for locking yourself to something. No, you're just a person in a a very political system that's killing poor people. What if nobody had to go alone? It would be totally different. All the outcomes would be completely different. And I also think that more people would be exposed to what these systems are, and it would raise greater and greater mobilization around dismantling them. Another example is defense committees. Obviously, there's such a long, beautiful history of defense committee work and all the movements we've been discussing all weekend. Right now, I want to point you all to the organization Survived and Punished, which is lifting up and doing defense around cases of, often many queer and trans and women of color, people who've been incarcerated for defending themselves against harm. Really amazing work being done there. And then obviously all the examples of people's recovery and disaster relief work that's going on, and whether it's in Puerto Rico or Houston or wherever, that's, New Orleans, all these places where we've seen FEMA doesn't show up, it's not going to start showing up. And when it does show up, it does, racist, horrible, scary things. And so, and it's, militarized response. So what are we going to do when the next storm, the next earthquake, and all these things which are happening all the time? Final summary points. Mutual aid is about material survival, centering the most impacted. It's about disaster preparedness, and it's about mobilizing participation. And that's why I feel like, obviously, all the ingredients of all of our movement work are essential, but my proposal to you all is really that I think we have to beef up mutual aid and look at the historical examples of mutual aid projects that have been strong and bold. We have to look at what's different in some of the conditions now, and we need kind of like all hands on deck, and it really needs to be a very intergenerational framework. There's different things that people have to offer at different ages to these processes. And part of that for me too, like, I'm really wondering what's going to happen to a lot of amazing radical queer and trans activists as we see people aging, and what's the mutual aid to support people as they get old. This country is a very, 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 very scary, dangerous place to get old in unless you're propertied. And so I think we need to have that be a centerpiece, and that would also build some of the intergenerational relationships and wisdom passing that could support all of our efforts, I think. Relationship skills, yeah. And I'm just going to close with this image from Seth Bachman. I think it kind of captures the urgency of mutual aid right now, and I love the simplicity of it. So let's have a discussion.